happened to my son? Okay. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. It's now 10:30, so you have been introduced to and let into the inner circle, inner sanctum of brainstorming the human connection. And this is a program brought to you by the South Dakota Humanities Council. And we are trying to get people to brainstorm all kinds of issues that we have as humans. And what that means really is that it really happens when you join the conversation. So I want to start this program by reminding all of us that you are welcome in this conversation. We'll get a conversation started, but it's not just between the guest and I, it's between all of us, and we can all benefit by sharing each other's perspective. The more perspective we have, the more depth we have in our views. So today's guest is quite appropriate for the weather today because many of us are not sort of going outside in our thongs and bikinis or anything like that. We are not doing that in South Dakota, that's for sure today. And some of you may be in other places, but we are hunkered down, and it's a reminder of our climate and the climate that we live in, and also how much climate shapes what we do, what we feel, how we feel, our interactions with each other, whether or not we can work or not, and what kind of work we can do. Some people can't go to work, and other people, they have to go to work, or else the rest of us really suffer. So all of those things are determined a lot by climate. In fact, today's show may be impacted because some people are having some issues with stability of their internet connection. That said, if we do have some kind of blackout and it suddenly is not working, we will have Laura back on. We're planning now just tentatively for the 5th of January. And so we can continue this discussion, and hopefully we'll have more cooperation with the climate and our weather. So that said, welcome Laura Edwards. And Laura Edwards is the state climatologist, and she's working out of South Dakota State University Extension. And she's going to tell you more about what she does and why she does it. So welcome, Laura. How are you today?
Hi, great. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation from Colby and Lawrence to visit with you today. Where do you want to start? Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to start with a little bit about Laura. Who are you? Where did you come from? And other than being a climatologist, just looking at your radiant beauty, I know that you do lots of stuff. So I'm going to guess that you do anyway. You have another life outside of the of being a climatologist. So other than that time you jumped out of the cake on the party, what kind of things do you do?
That's a fib. I never did that.
Oh, that wasn't you.
That was somebody else. That was my doppelganger. Yeah. So I grew up in the Twin Cities, Brooklyn Center, just north of Minneapolis, and went to school there. At my undergraduate degree is from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and my degree is in physics and French, knowing I wanted to go into meteorology, but I also wanted to study abroad, and I really liked French. And so I got to do that in undergrad for my bachelor's degree, and then graduate school, I went to University of Maryland in the Beltway there in the DC area for meteorology. And when I was there, I was hired in the state climate office as the assistant state climatologist. So that was kind of my first foray into what I call climate services or applied climatology. And from there, after I finished there, I was hired in Reno, Nevada at the Western Regional Climate Center. I got married in that transition between graduate school and my first job there in Reno. And I worked for 8 years as a research climatologist there. During that time, one of the jobs I did was become an author of the U.S. Drought Monitor, which I know has a lot of visibility among the agricultural community, has a lot of impacts there. And one of the other things that I was fortunate to do was lead an NSF-funded program for women in science, kind of targeting early career women in atmospheric science between their college or postgraduate work into their career field. So it was really a great opportunity, and that's first when I got interested in diversity, equity, inclusion in a formal way, I should say. I came to SDSU in 2011, and by then we had twin boys, so they came with us, and they were less than 2 years old at the time. And first I was hired in extension as a field specialist, which is essentially someone off campus with extension. And I was promoted to the state climatologist in January of 2017. So now we live just outside of Aberdeen on the farm. We don't, fortunately, we get to enjoy the farm, but my in-laws do all the work mostly. My brother-in-law and father-in-law do most of the farming, but we get to enjoy living out in the country and do gardening and see wildlife and all those other fun things too. So, and now my boys are 12, almost 13 years old.
So tell us, what does a climatologist do?
So it's a lot of things looking back in history, looking at trends. Even I get a lot of requests of what was the weather or the climate at a specific point in time, at a specific place. And so I answer a lot of those kinds of questions. But also looking forward, weather is kind of this current time, maybe out to a week or two in advance is kind of the area of weather. But when we start looking at 2 weeks to months to years to decades, that's the realm of climate. And so I work a lot, very closely with our partners at the National Weather Service and NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and my fellow state climatologists all around the country, looking at what are climate impacts on agriculture, on communities, how can we better plan for changes in climate. I also do a lot of things with the state as far as hazards for drought and flooding. And I work with, because I'm embedded within Extension, I work very closely with my Extension colleagues, of course, primarily in the agricultural sector, both crops and livestock. But, planning for short-term, seasonal forecasts all the way out to decades. How can we help farmers be more sustainable and productive and economically viable in the future? So kind of a little of everything when it comes to state climatologist, touching a lot of different communities, a lot of different agencies, a lot of different partners across the state and the region.
So would the summary of that be, or could it be, that you interpret the climatology for citizens?
Yeah, I think that's pretty close. Sometimes I like to say I'm a bridge between the science and the users or stakeholders. Kind of translating, maybe the science into decisions. Yep.
Okay. All right, great. So what goes into climate? Okay, so when I'm guessing there's some things that happen that create climate, and without doing a PhD thesis, what could you say are the things that impact climate?
So then we're talking about more Earth system science, and what are the feedbacks. So the main driver of heat on the planet is the sun. How much sunlight, how much radiation or heat from the sun do we get? And then that interacts with land surface. You know, what is covering the land? What color is it? You know, is it cold? Is it hot? All those kinds of things. Is it water or land? And in between, we have our atmosphere, and that's where we're talking about greenhouse gases. You know, without greenhouse gases, our Earth would be a lot colder than it is now. So greenhouse gases are beneficial for kind of keeping us in the Goldilocks zone. So we're not too hot, not too cold. But that's also where we're talking about human impact on climate in the big sense, in the big global sense, because we are now and have been for quite a while contributing more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere than the natural system does by itself. And so that's the part where you know, humans have an impact on the climate more so than the other areas.
Mm-hmm. Well, now that you mentioned that, there's a burning question that I've had since I started learning those kind of things that you've been talking about. Is it seems like at one point, oxygen, as you know, that we need, was let's say a toxin to most of the life on the planet. And then there was this shift where those organisms sort of apparently went inside of us or other animals and started to do their kind of greenhouse gas and create a climate inside of us. And for some reason, I have the feeling that they're trying to come out again and drive oxygen down. Do you get my drift about that pattern? I'm guessing that you've at least heard about something like that.
You know, I haven't heard much about that. Not that
Okay,
perspective, but yeah.
Yeah, maybe not that perspective, but you've heard about, like, it wasn't always let's say oxygen wasn't always at 20%. And we had a different kind of organisms that were alive, but they like a different kind of gas mix. And then there was a shift in those organisms, and organisms that put out oxygen started to as let's say for them a greenhouse gas. It changes the atmosphere, and so the ones that don't like oxygen or can't live with oxygen very well, they receded, and the ones who were aerobes, in other words, the anaerobes, or the ones that don't like oxygen, they receded, and then the ones who are aerobes, like us, you know, they sort of started to dominate the planet.
Well, and I think too, I mean, we have a few billion years of history of the planet, right?
Yes,
So
yes,
certainly
right.
species have evolved to adapt to the environment, you know, that we're in. And I
Yeah.
think that's one of the concerns with a changing climate currently, in that humans are changing the composition of the atmosphere faster than natural systems would on their own. And then, you know, as a result of that, temperature and precipitation patterns are changing on the surface. And the question then is, can species adapt fast enough to respond to the change? And further yet, can we mitigate or reduce even the emission, the things that are changing the climate in the first place, to slow down the change that's occurring? So yeah, certainly there, you know, being able to evolve or adapt to the change is one of the questions, you know, with the changing climate as quickly as we're seeing it happen currently in the last several decades.
Right. That's actually where I was going with the question, is that those organisms that put out their, let's say, excrement and gases made the earth, let's say, less habitable for them. And then another species came out, and I'm wondering if we are doing the same thing to ourselves, like creating a situation where we can't live, and or it makes it difficult for us to live. And maybe that's in a way kind of what we're talking about in the big picture.
Yeah, that's an interesting question on there was just some news yesterday I saw about how our lifetime, our life expectancy now in the United States is actually starting to get shorter again.
Yes,
Since the baby boom era, we've had longer life expectancies year to year, and now people that are born today have shorter than our generation did. Um, I don't know how much of that is climate, environment, or other factors. There's a lot
sure,
that goes into that.
sure.
But
Probably a combination.
mhm, mhm.
That
Yeah,
would be my
and
guess.
the changes in climate that we're experiencing here, depending where you are on the globe, not are all negative. You know,
Mhm,
some areas are more favorable, for humans to inhabit, um,
mhm.
depending what you're sensitive to.
Exactly.
So yeah,
And which island you're on, right?
yeah, right, right.
So I want to remind our guests, or our other panelists, I should say, that this is a show where you get to ask questions and interact with our guest. So don't wait till the last minute to get your questions in, because we kind of cut off at 11:30. So don't wait till the end to get your questions. Even if you don't want to speak up, please put your questions in the chat, and then we will try to hand those over to Laura. Let's talk a little bit about the difference between climate change, global warming, and weather. You talked a little bit about the difference between weather and climate, but a lot of those words get tossed around enough that we can become, let's say, a little bit confused about the conversation because we're not quite sure what the words mean. Could you help us with that?
Sure. So when we're talking about climate, that's generally our long-term averages. If you're looking at the statistics definition of it, what are long-term averages? Another way maybe to think about it is climate versus weather. Maybe you've heard this: climate is what you expect, weather is what you get.
Mhm.
Looking at weather as the day-to-day or even hour by hour, changes in precipitation, temperature, wind, what have you. So weather tends to be more in that short-term time scale, and climate really more in the long-term time scale. To differentiate that between that and global warming, or climate change, that's where we're talking about trends and really long-term climate, and how that might change, or not, depending where you are, going into the future, or what we've seen historically. If we can expect the same essentially today as we could at some other point in time in the past.
Mhm.
So hopefully that helps a little bit there.
So yeah, so how does when people talk about climate change versus global warming, what I mean, those two phrases are often interchanged. Can you help us clear up the difference, if there is a difference, or can you talk about that?
Sure. I think what comes with those words, global warming or climate change, tend to be more perception. And, certainly sometimes there's a political tie to that, right? To how that's defined or understood. Global warming, generally speaks just to the temperature changes that we've seen or expect to see. But climate change is maybe a better term to use. In one example here in South Dakota, we do experience or have experienced warming temperatures, but we've also increased precipitation also. And so a big impact that we're seeing here in South Dakota is actually a wetter climate than we've seen, several decades ago. So I think climate change is maybe a better descriptor, a little more broad as far as um, how it's understood as to what our climate could include, not just
Yeah,
temperature.
I'm gonna
Um,
throw out, I'm gonna throw out something just for maybe clarification. I hope it's clarifying rather than making it more confusing. But it seems like when we talk about global warming, it's like the total impact, if there's one thing that we're looking at that's going up, is like in total, the Earth's average or aggregate climate, or not climate, temperature is rising. Would that be a correct statement or not?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's, yeah, global warming is describing more the global temperature trend going upward. Yeah.
Right. And since temperature impacts the climate, then all kinds of things shift underneath that heading, and then including the weather. So if we were looking at a pyramid, the top would be there's a global warming that's impacting the change in climate, which can be different things in different places and different things in different places. And that those different things would be the weather in different places would be changing to some degree in some different way on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that's one way to think about it. Yeah, and just to get back to the term global warming, not everywhere in the country even is warming. You know, parts of the Southeast are actually getting cooler
Yeah.
on the trend. So it's kind of a misnomer depending where you are. But yeah, it's
We are
yeah,
not.
another way to think about, you know, weather versus climate, maybe to make a baseball analogy. And scientist Jerry Meal in Colorado kind of made this analogy that I first saw. Let's say you have a baseball player on steroids. That's what we're doing. We're loading the dice essentially with increasing greenhouse gases, right? So there's a baseball player on steroids. He's not going to hit a home run every at bat, but he will hit more home runs over a season or over a career because he's loaded, you know, loaded his chances of that happening. And that's kind of one way to think about climate change, or kind of loading the dice, or changing our probability of having these more extreme warmer days and more extreme wetter days over time.
Okay. Well, we'll move on. We got some questions from the Facebook. I think,
Yep.
Carolyn, you had some?
Yeah, so Carla on Facebook said, hi, she heard you at the state fair this summer and it was a very enjoyable presentation. You said we would have another La Nina third winter. Is this still the thoughts? And then after that question, we have 3 in the chat for you too. So
Sure.
Yeah, yes. So to answer the La Nina question, yes, we're still in a La Nina pattern now for our 3rd winter in a row. This has only happened twice before since 1950, so this is not very common to see this. And what La Nina brings to our part of the country typically is colder than average temperatures in the winter. That'd be December through February. And so certainly we've seen that already here this winter with colder than average temperatures here over the last couple of weeks. And looks like that is expected to continue here mostly through the end of the month. And yeah, as far as precipitation goes with La Nina years, we don't see a strong correlation historically with La Nina and wintertime precipitation. It's mostly just a temperature signal or a temperature response here in South Dakota.
So,
okay. Oh, did you have something to add to that, Lawrence?
no, I was just going to say,
Okay.
could you go ahead with the other
Yep.
questions?
So Sharon says, this may be too personal, but you live now on a working farm. Are your expertise included in the family's farming plans?
Yeah, so I try to stay out of the farming decisions too much. Yeah, we talk about the climate outlook and that kind of thing, but as far as you know, their management and their long-term plans, you know, I keep that to the farmers. But I do know my brother-in-law has implemented, you know, more sustainable practices. He's added wheat into his crop rotation, so now he's in a 3-crop rotation. And they've been doing less tillage than they used to do, you know, practices like that. and so I know that they're trying to take care of a lot of the waterways up at the farm as well. So I think, I kind of keep the farm business to them, and wait for them to ask me most of the time. Yeah.
Okay, and then Richard said, I have heard about the use of rolling 20 to 30-year climate look backs by climate scientists. What have those looked like in South Dakota recently? And how do you think recent climate trends may affect crop choices going forward over the next few decades?
Well, first I'll address the 20 to 30-year question. So yeah, we do use what we call 30-year normals, 30-year periods. And nationally, those are updated every decade. So we just got an update last year in 2021. And the 30-year period is defined by the World Meteorological Organization. And that was established 80 years ago, maybe. And I think at the time it was a period of record or a length of record that a lot of places around the globe had access to. Here in the US, we have, weather data going back to the mid to late 1800s. Parts of Europe are centuries old weather records, but globally, 30 years of record was, I think, more or less achievable. And also that's a statistical kind of minimum to define a normal or an average. And so, yeah, we do use 30-year periods quite often. The last update, yeah, we've seen increases in precipitation. And that's really essentially just comparing the 2010s, right, that decade, to the 80 to 90s, because we have that 30-year kind of rolling window. So those middle two decades are essentially the same. But so yeah, we have seen increased precipitation and increase in temperature over that time. So how do we, looking at crop choices, I think we have already seen a shift in crop choices. Part of that is due to climate. Where we have a wetter climate, a longer growing season, a longer frost-free season, however you want to describe that. So that creates an opportunity to grow more things like corn and soybeans. So there has been a transition from what used to be more wheat fallow, in the summer, now towards corn and soybean rotation, especially in eastern, northern South Dakota, and that's kind of gradually stepping westward as we go through time. Another driver of that, though, is economics and marketing. Can they make money growing corn and soybeans? Even if they get one good year out of 5, can they make it? Or use it alternative feed for livestock or something like that. So there's a lot of decisions that go into crop choices other than just climate. I would say a lot of it is economics driven.
And in response to the first part of Richard's question, he's now asking, are there maps available to show these changes in precip and temp across the state?
Yes, there are. I might have to send that to you offline if I can send it through the Humanities Council. There are, and it's actually, there's some national maps that will show that those changes in temperature and precipitation from the old, what we call the old normals to the new normals. So I can send that link to you.
Okay. And if anybody would like me to pass that on when she shares it with us, if you want to just send your email or address to info@sdhumanities.org, that would be great. And then the question,
Carol, and make sure that they put what they're asking for.
Yeah, don't just send me your email. Put in the notes that you want them at. Okay, and then Carrie says, I have heard that the line of the Great American Desert, which ran basically near the dividing line of East and West South Dakota, is shifting farther east due to climate change. If that is true, we will need to make changes to the crop varieties grown in eastern South Dakota. Using your data, how closely do you work with the field specialists developing those new varieties for farmers in the state and region?
Yeah, so yeah, there's been a lot of talk over the last few years, I'd say, over the 100th meridian, right? The 100th longitudinal line, and I think that's what Carrie might be referring to here. And we don't develop a lot of varieties at SDSU. We have wheat breeders who develop wheat varieties, and I believe oats are most of it. Some that small grains, but a lot of like the corn and soybean development is done by private sector. Some of those bigger seed companies. Um, and I would say that they are very in tune with a changing climate and what's going on in their growing region and potential region for expansion. Coming out with more drought resistant varieties, for example, and ones that are resistant to different kinds of diseases. Because with warmer winters, we could see overwintering of some disease, some pests that we haven't seen before, things like that, and other, new insects and new pests or disease that are coming in into our region. So, I think those seed companies are pretty sophisticated and pretty knowledgeable. And they're working way far ahead. I mean, they are thinking decades ahead on their business and what kind of seeds and traits that we'll need in the future. But there are choices to the grower, and so they get to choose, among a menu of options, what they want to grow to. So, but yeah, I'd say we don't do a lot here outside of the small grains part for wheat and oats and those kinds of things at SDSU.
So that's all I have for now, but to everybody watching, I did put that email address in the chat if you would like me to forward that map information on to you. I don't have any other questions for now.
Okay, so we'll continue. Laura, how does climate change affect our lives here in South Dakota? Maybe let's start with agriculture. What kinds of changes can we expect? Have we seen? Are we experiencing now?
Yeah, so I've kind of hit on some of that already, where we see temperatures warming annually. If we just look at annual average temperature, we see temperatures warming here in South Dakota, but it's not even across all the seasons. We see warming occurring faster in the winter season and generally slower in the summer season. Similar to precipitation too, we see increases in precipitation annually when you look at annual totals, and again, not even in every season. Historically, over the last several decades, we've seen the biggest increases in spring and fall, which have a big impact on farming operation, because you think of it, spring you're trying to plant and fall you're trying to harvest. Like those are two times where you really want to cover every acre and you really want to be out there doing the work. And so we've seen some delays in spring planting. We've seen slow harvests in the fall with excess moisture and increased cost to dry grain after it is harvested because it's too wet, things like that. In the future, as far as precipitation goes, what we may see is a shift in some of that seasonal change, with more increases in the wintertime in spring, not so much the fall and the spring. So that's something that we may see going forward, that's being projected in the future. Other impacts, with a warmer climate, we're also seeing longer growing seasons, or more days between the last spring frost and the first fall frost. And so that frost-free season, we're seeing getting longer by already about 10 days. And that's expected to continue to see going forward.
You mean it's expected that they will continue to increase? Or
Yep, that we'll see longer growing seasons. So about 10 more days by the time we get to about 2060, 2070, in that range. So continue to see a lengthening of the growing season, which here is an opportunity like I said, for agriculture, for row crops at least, you have a longer growing season and more water. That generally is favorable. One thing about precipitation, though, is that we are also seeing precipitation occur in larger events with short-term dry periods, could call it drought, in between. And so one of the challenges I think for farming here today is managing moisture, managing your soils mostly, to be able to take in the moisture when it rains and hold it through those dry periods,
Or we could get,
because it's uneven.
or we could get two FEMA checks, one for drought and one for flooding.
Yeah, you could. And yeah, it's actually not on. We have seen this not too long ago, a couple years ago. We saw some counties that started off in flood, too wet to plant, and they ended up in drought by the end of the growing season. So
Sure.
we have seen that in crop insurance claims is where
Sure.
we see that. Yeah.
How about tourism? How would climate change affect tourism, since that's our second largest industry in South Dakota?
Yeah. That's kind of a mixed bag, I mean, I think some people like it more green, and I think, a lot of tourism is tied to recreation, hunting and fishing around here. And, those kind of industries, I think, will still thrive. This year we had, as far as I know up here, fantastic year for pheasants and deer, great hunting season. That can bring in a lot of tourism too. One area, the Black Hills, very popular summer destination. My colleague, Dr. Darren Clabo, he's a state wildland fire meteorologist out of Rapid City at the School of Mines. And wildland fire is a risk, that is changing. To hear him talk now and what he and I have visited about is we're now essentially in a 12-month fire season. We don't have a month where where large fire is not possible. Thinking about to 2017, that was a drought year for sure. We saw the largest fire in timber that we've seen at the Legion Lake fire. Tens of thousands of acres. We saw similar, the cottonwood fire on the grass in the prairie the year before, burned like 40,000 acres. So, we can see fire now, I think, almost any time of year. And that maybe is one way that climate change could be affecting tourism, through camping and, those kinds of activities.
So are you saying that even in those flooding times, the period of the year where there's flooding, that we can also see these wildfires?
Yep. So it's kind of interesting, depending how the flood occurs, right? So like last spring, I'll use this example here in spring of 2022. It was pretty dry here in eastern, well, not the far northeast, but along the James River Valley. But the river itself was flooding because North Dakota had a ton of snow. And so all that snow is melting coming into the river, but the grass and the prairie outside of the river itself was pretty dry. So yeah, it is possible to have a drought and a flood at the same time, as ironic as that sounds.
Quite interesting. How about in our daily lives? What kind of shifts can we expect when when we're changing the climate? Is there are things we can do and things we can't do. Can you give us some ideas of how the climate change is affecting people's daily lives?
So I visited last week with the city of Sioux Falls at their sustainability summit, and thinking within more of an urban lens, where people live. I think the increase in moisture is a concern, especially with growing populations in areas like Sioux Falls. Being very conscientious of where you build a house, where you put businesses in the floodplains or not, and developing a city that can move water when it has to. Daily lives, we're, getting back to greenhouse gas emissions, it's been proven that greenhouse gas emissions on the global sense um, can do affect climate in the long sense. And so, reducing your energy demand, your greenhouse gas use. And I know a lot of utility companies are doing a lot on their part to invest in renewable energy. Myself, we bought a hybrid vehicle this last year. We probably would have bought a full electric if we could, but the ranges aren't far enough yet. I can't drive to Sioux Falls and back on one single charge from where I'm at. But yeah, and I think too, home energy use is a big thing. Insulating your home and making it as energy efficient as possible is another way that each one of us can maybe make some small changes in our daily life.
Okay. But I'm thinking actually about our daily plans, how we go about our daily lives. I think it's very important to look at the contributions we do and do make and could make. But I think also, like, let's say maybe it's the weather events, but then the weather events happen because of climate events. So what kind of shifts can we probably be making in terms of like how we carry on in our daily lives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think and everyone has different ability, different things that they have access to, financially or just of geography where they are. So it's kind of hard to say generalities. A couple of things here. Reducing your waste is one idea. I think COVID during the pandemic brought to light, how much energy we can save by staying home or working remote, not driving as much, those kinds of things. I mean, there's a trade-off. You're using electricity and other things at home, but reducing our commute, and in South Dakota, some people commute really short distances and some really far. So there are things like that we can do. Yeah, I think that's a little more difficult question to say in the day to day, what you can do. Yeah.
But I was thinking,
Lawrence, I think a lot kind of answering your part of your question. Richard said the strong storm frequency may affect our insurance rates and risk of damage to our property, wind, hail, etc.
That's certainly one. And I was thinking also about what kind of clothes that we wear, what kind of clothes that we buy. I was thinking also about people who are, what kind of holidays we can celebrate. For example, in some schools, maybe for other reasons than climate, they don't celebrate Martin Luther King's Day because they're saving the days, they say, for because they might have may need the storm days. Well, as we need more storm days, that could impact how many, how often kids can go to school, for example, or how many days people can go to church, those overall. So I was thinking more like those kind of day-to-day changes, because I think we relate more to immediate things that disturb our daily habits. And maybe that's another way for people to think about climate change as opposed to bigger pictures, which they seem to have trouble seeing themselves in those bigger pictures.
Yeah, and I think farmers are adapting pretty quickly to these changes. We're looking at just recently, 2019, the wettest year in history for South Dakota, heads and shoulders above 1915, the previous wet year. And now here we are, 2-3 years later, facing, basically a drought that's maybe 3 times in a century kind of severity, 3 to 5 times per century, depending where you're at in the state. And so, yeah, I think farmers are adapting quickly to these big swings, wet to dry, and back and forth. 2011, 2012, another example where we had record flooding on the Missouri River, followed by 2012 with extreme severe drought in the southeastern part of the state. So yeah, I think in the agriculture side where I work with a lot of the time, they're already thinking of these extremes and planning out ahead.
So I think we have a question from Sharon, who
Yep.
says, I live in Brooklyn, your old neighbor.
Oh yeah, Brooklyn Park, yeah.
Yeah, Brooklyn Park. But I drive to Mobridge as often as I can to visit my sister and family. I've noticed a stickler, is that it? Oh,
Stickier.
stickier air, and concluded it was from Oahe, but maybe it's from the climate getting wetter. They've had a drought last year and the months preceding it. It could be like baseball players on steroids.
Yeah, well, great to visit someone from Brooklyn Park. So yeah, we are getting more humid air for sure. And so when we're looking at the temperature increases we've seen here in South Dakota, we actually see our minimum overnight temperatures warming faster than our daytime temperatures. And a lot of that is driven by increased humidity. We're not cooling as much at nighttime. And furthermore, part of that is because our landscape has changed because of the widespread changes from fallow ground to corn and soybeans. Corn pumps out a lot of water when it's growing, and so we feel a lot of humidity here, at the surface where we live and where we experience climate. And so, yeah, increased humidity is partly due to the change in landscape and cropping systems, partly due to more moisture coming in from the south in the summer, and an increase in temperature. Warmer air holds more moisture. And so we're more humid for many reasons. And that's probably what you feel up in north central South Dakota and the Mobridge area.
Can we talk a little bit about other species? We've been talking about the impact directly on humans, but as we can clearly see, we aren't the only animals on the planet. What kind of changes have we seen with other species and how they're adjusting to climate change?
Yeah, so there's a lot of there are a lot of good examples of this in the Mountain West. So in general, climate zones are moving northward due to temperature increases. So we see temperature zones moving northward. But when we look in the mountain environment, they also move upward in elevation to maintain that same temperature zone. Climate zones are moving upward in elevation. And so the examples in the mountain west and the Rockies and Sierra Nevada and so on are that species are becoming more and more concentrated, because as you go higher in elevation, you get less area and they can't migrate very well, especially if they're something like a pika, like little tiny mouse species. They can't fly to where they need to where they want to go, for example. Their migration is very limited. So we do see that. I'm trying to think of other species here in South Dakota in wildlife or other species. Haven't seen too much.
Have we seen new ones? Ones that are migrating and are changing their habitat based on climate change?
I think we've seen some in the agriculture sector and the pest side, pest and disease. So just this last fall, the disease side in corn, where we see tar spot was confirmed here in South Dakota. Again, that's brought up with southerly winds that carry it northward. And then finally, now we have a climate favorable for that disease to take hold. couple other, new soybean pests that are just been discovered some years ago, and they're still trying to figure out what climate zone they're adapting to, because it seems like they don't like sub-freezing temperatures very much, but somehow they come back each spring. And so we do see that on the agricultural sector as already. I know in waterfowl and migratory species, the availability of water in what we call the prairie pothole ecosystem in eastern South Dakota, all those little spots of water in that glacial plain area, it has kind of changed migratory timing, how long they hang out and nest and stay in the area. And so water availability, both wet and dry, changes their migratory patterns as well in spring and fall.
Mhm.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
We have another chat. Carrie said it seems like there are more dramatic differences in smaller geographic regions, counties, with drought and flood than 40 to 50 years ago. When I was a kid, it seemed like it was typical to have more widely distributed rain or drought, and now it seems more pocketed. Am I imagining that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a good question, Carrie. And I think this year, 2022, was very much like that. Very local areas of drought or wetter conditions. When we're looking at the U.S. Drought Monitor with my colleagues around the state, we talk about drought every week, and because that map is updated every week. And this year, more than the last 10 years, we really struggled with, okay, we have this national map. How small can we make these circles or these areas on the drought monitor? Because everything was very local here and there. So I'd say that's certainly true in the data that we saw this summer. Not always is that the case, because kind of over, average, if you look at a whole season even, drier or wetter areas kind of pop up in general. But yeah, this year was very, very pocketed, as she says. Yeah.
That brings up the question of how do you actually collect this data?
So that's a good question. We use everything and anything that we can get our hands on. National Weather Service has the longest running network of weather and climate observers, and there's still people, maybe some of you know them, but they have a whole group of cooperative observers that take daily maximum and minimum temperature and precipitation, including snow, every day of this week. And they report that. Hopefully, most everyone does it every day now. Some people still do it on a paper form and mail it in, but most of them do it on the internet or on a phone system. We also have, with SDSU, a network of weather stations across the state that we call the Mesonet, MESONET. And that is turning into a real fabulous resource. We have about 40 some weather stations across the state, reporting live every 5 minutes. You guys can see the weather. They've got webcams on them. They're in the midst of a very large upgrade and expansion plan, funded mostly by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who's interested in improving their flood forecasting in the Missouri River Basin. And so pretty soon, I'd say within 4 or 5 years, we'll see over 150 weather stations across South Dakota, measuring everything from precipitation, temperature, to soil moisture, wind speeds, all kinds of things. And they're measuring snowpack and snowfall too. So I'd encourage you to check them out. We also have a great volunteer weather watcher group called COCORAS, Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. I know it's a mouthful, but those are volunteers. Maybe some of you are volunteers too. And they just measure rain and snow and report that either on an app on their phone or on the computer each day. So those are like the 3 main sources that we use for weather data: the Weather Service, the Mesonet, and cocoa raws, because then we can get a pretty good coverage across the state, kind of what's going on day to day.
How about satellites? Are you guys using those at all, or with
Oh, yep,
you
yep,
connect, hook up with NOAA, or how's
sure
that
do.
work?
Yep. Yep. We use satellite more and more, and radar, of course. We've got 3 radars across the state, but there are a few holes where radars, are kind of at the max of their range for some of those areas. So, yeah, we use satellite a lot to look at like what color the surface is. If it's green in the summer or brown, or how much snow cover we have across the state. When it's white like this. And satellite technology is really sophisticated now. They can actually estimate, shallow soil moisture to determine some drought, if drought is present, um, and a lot of other different things on vegetation. Very sophisticated ways of looking at vegetation and land cover too. So, yeah, there's a lot of really great data out there. Yeah.
So it would be safe to say that there is a lot of data to crunch, and the resolution of that data is getting better. In other words, to be able to use it to make more distinct decisions and observations is getting much better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say so. And um, nationally speaking, as far as short-term climate goes, they're investing a lot into they call it sub-seasonal to seasonal. So say that 2 or 3 week out to about 6 months. They're investing a lot of resources into improving their forecasting in that range. And I think we're going to start to see some payoffs of that in the coming years. But investing a lot in modeling, again, into measuring what the land and rivers and all our water bodies are doing today as better inputs into understanding, all those feedbacks on the weeks to months time scale. So hopefully we can do better forecasting at those time scales.
Sure. Well, we talked a little bit, we're getting short on time, but we talked a little bit about other animal species and maybe some fungi, bacteria, and those kind of things. But how about flora or plant life? Are we seeing any new things there? Are there things that we used to be able to plant with ease as gardeners that we can't now, and things that we wouldn't think about? One thing I think about is sometimes like some of the potato crops or something like that, that people, sweet potatoes and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I enjoy gardening too, so I like experimenting with things. One thing is on the shrub and tree side, landscaping and maybe fruit trees, those kinds of things. We're seeing warmer winters, and so that's what you see those reflected on the back of your seed packet is the plant hardiness zones. Those are defined by what's the coldest winter temperature we're going to see, and can this shrub or tree survive in the winter? And so we're seeing those climate zones for those plant hardiness zones move northward. And here in the northern plains, one of my friends out west, he did a climate modeling study, and they determined that in the northern plains here, our climate zones are moving faster than anywhere else in the lower 48 states. About 50 miles northward in the next 30 to 40 years, maybe a little bit longer than that. But we're seeing very rapid movement northward of those plant hardiness zones. So yeah, if you haven't, or if you need to start planting some new landscaping plants, maybe something to look at, maybe try. I mean, it might not work all the time every year, but maybe start experimenting with some of those shrubs and trees that are adapted to a warmer climate. Yeah, and we see that longer frost-free season. So I know there's old wives' tales about, plant your potatoes on Good Friday, the Friday before Easter or something like that. Many years that might still work, but maybe you want to consider changing that, if the climate is starting to warm in the spring season for you. Yeah.
Right. Well, and we might want to start to consider bananas and vanilla as one of our some of our crops. This has been a wonderful discussion, Laura. Well, unfortunately, we're pretty much out of time now. I'm hoping that we'll have you back at some point if folks have more questions, because the climate is going to keep changing as far as we know, and hopefully we'll still be around if it doesn't change too radically too quick. So thank you very much. Thanks everyone for showing up and being a part of this conversation. We'll see you same time, same station next week. Bye-bye.